All right. This morning I have with me Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and we are going to be talking about the Russia-Ukraine war. And he's going to be helping us better understand what's really going on with NATO, with Russia, and with Ukraine. Colonel Macgregor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. So I want to jump in. From my view, it seems that Ukraine has become the 51st state of the United States. We're essentially funding their government. We're keeping their people afloat using U.S. taxpayer money. However, Americans and especially Europeans are tiring of this war quickly. They're starting to protest. They're demanding peace. Yet some NATO nations, including the United States, seem to want this war to drag out. Will NATO only back off when Ukraine is destroyed, or when Vladimir Putin dies or is taken out by his own regime? What are your thoughts on this situation?
Well, the first question is a valid one. How long do we wait before we finally give up on trying to turn Ukraine into a permanent and existential threat to Russia? Because that's really what this is all about. We invested very heavily in Ukraine starting in 2014 to build this Ukrainian army that by the time the Russians intervened was about 600,000. That was a little over 400,000 regular troops with over 200,000 reserves. And it was aimed exclusively at the destruction of Russia, first to attack the so-called breakaway provinces, Donetsk and Luhansk, that were in the east, and then to go on and reconquer, if you will, Crimea, which historically was never part of Ukraine or remotely Ukrainian, what was Russian, certainly since 1776. So at any rate, I think to answer the first question is that it's unclear. We know that Washington, London, Paris and Berlin have essentially sworn to stay the course. That picture, as you point out, is weakening very rapidly in Germany, where it was never popular to begin with. It's also faltering in France. London seems to stick with it, although I'm beginning to see some evidence of the truth getting through the British media to the British public. Not much, but some. The other country that seems unalterably opposed to ending this is Norway. I've still not figured out why the Norwegians are so bent on the destruction of Russia, but apparently they've signed on for this. The problem with all of it, of course, is that there was never any strategy, coherent strategy with a specific strategic end state that was attainable. I mean, making these sweeping statements, we won't quit until Putin is removed from power or dead. We won't stop until Russia is defeated in Ukraine. These are ridiculous statements that have no basis in fact, have no possibility of occurring. So that puts you in the uncomfortable position when you've made these ridiculous statements publicly to where you cannot retreat from them. And so London, Paris, Berlin, Washington are having enormous difficulty figuring out, how do I retreat from these outrageous demands and still look reasonably intelligent and competent? Well, the answer is you can't, without admitting that you were wrong. And this is the biggest problem of all. Russia was not isolated, could never be isolated. Russia's economy is doing extremely well. It would do better without the war, but it's still doing very well. It has no shortage of trade partners, and much of what Russia provides to Europe is still finding its way to Europe through clandestine and illegal means offered by other countries that are willing to provide the middleman. The whole thing is a travesty. The Russians, who initially went in exclusively for the purpose of reaching some sort of agreement with the West about Eastern Ukraine, about the breakaway republics, discovered that we weren't interested in a solution. We were interested in destroying them. And so they have now mobilized. They've built this enormous force. They're poised to attack. The Ukrainians are falling apart. The question is, what are we going to do? And I think we're not going to do anything until the Russians are probably just across the river from Kiev in great numbers, prepared to cross the Dnieper River and go west. I wish it weren't so, but I think that's where we are. the Russians are going to have to make it unambiguously clear that our outrageous demands make no sense. And at that point, there's a real chance that the Europeans will diverge from us, because Europe is really being hurt by this war. Everybody in the West is being hurt, but the Europeans, most of all, their economies, their populations have no interest whatsoever in going to war with Russia. If you look at the polling data, they're overwhelmingly for a negotiated settlement. So the bottom line is, how long does this last? It lasts until the Europeans really can't stand it anymore, and we begin to see some European governments fall. We've already seen things change in Italy. Mr. Macron's position is not that strong, but the real weak link at this point is Berlin. And one wonders how much longer Mr. Scholz can hold on to his job. We had, 50,000 protesters in Berlin over the weekend against the war. Somebody said, well, there were still 10,000 that came out to support the war. Well, I think that's a good demonstration of just where we are. So once Berlin falters, and I think it will, because the German people just don't buy it any longer, then the world will change. And when Berlin decides to diverge, other European states will fall in line, and everyone will say enough is enough. We got to come to an arrangement. And all wars in Europe, at least for the last 500 to 1,000 years, have been settled with some sort of territorial adjustment, an exchange of land, and so forth. So that's what's got to happen. But again, neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine, and that's a good question right now. We don't know what will remain of it, because more than 10 million Ukrainians have left. There were already 2 million working in the EU before the 10 million left the country. All the Ukrainians that are being interviewed as they came out of Ukraine have all said, we will never go back. Now we add the numbers of casualties, which are horrific, and there are any number of different interpretations of numbers, but the numbers on the Ukrainian side are very large. Maybe as many as 200,000 dead by now, another 400,000 wounded. Most of these are people that will not recover from their wounds. They will be permanently disabled. So this has got to come to an end. I don't think there's much disagreement about it. But Mr. Zelensky is our puppet, and he's not going to give up or change his tune until we do. And we're not prepared to do it. So there's your answer.
Okay. Two-part question here. So the United States media continues to say Putin is crazy and he doesn't have an off-ramp for getting out of this. But we also see that maybe the United States doesn't have an off-ramp for getting out of this. Does this have something to do with Putin's intel saying this thing will be over in 3 days, and Joe Biden's intel saying this will be over in 3 days? And now here we are at the 1 year anniversary.
I think on the Russian side, it wasn't so much of an intelligence failure as Mr. Putin was convinced that the Western allies would ultimately negotiate with him once he made it clear that he was serious. Remember, he's been talking about halting the advance of NATO for almost 20 years. This is not a new topic. He's gone to various Munich security conferences, given speeches, and made it clear that the Russians will not accept NATO's encroachment on its borders. I always find it fanciful that people say, well, the Russians invaded Georgia. Well, the Russians went into Georgia because we were there, and we began making noises suggesting that Georgia, of all places, would become part of NATO. Again, he said, look, Ukraine is off limits. That touches us. We have a strong historical relationship with Ukraine. If you insist on turning this into an extension of NATO and threatening us, we will answer in kind. And so ultimately he did that. Where he miscalculated, in my judgment, was twofold. First, he said, I'm going to have a negotiating partner. I think he grossly miscalculated the attitude, not just in Kiev, but in London and Washington and Paris. But remember, this is also the same man who was unaware that we had lied to him during the Minsk Accords. Remember, the Minsk Accords were designed to address most of these concerns. Central to the whole Minsk Accords business and to his objections has always been Ukraine's unwillingness to treat Russians as equal citizens before the law in Ukraine. Instead, they've said, either you convert and become Ukrainian, you abandon your language, your culture, and identity, or you can't stay. and they embarked upon this horrible Ukrainianization. And the two republics were taken under fire. And they began lobbing artillery into those areas almost immediately after the coup in Ukraine in 2014. So they killed 14,000 people in that area long before Mr. Putin ever intervened. So his point is very valid. They were already at war with us. We were just not at war with them. So yeah, he miscalculated on those scales, and he sent in a very small force. He gave instructions to his officers: please don't do anything that will make a peace settlement impossible. We want to live with the Ukrainians. They are brother Slavs. They are Orthodox Christians. His generals shook their heads and said, this is not going to work very well. And he said, well, those are my orders. Minimize collateral damage, minimize casualties. It didn't work. On the Washington side, I live here, and so I talked to lots of people, and I think they were extraordinarily arrogant. And they assumed that, oh, Mr. Putin will never do this. He'll never use force. If he does, it'll be the end of Russia, and he knows that. Well, that was always wrong. They had absolutely ignored everything he said, and now the consequences are the war that we're currently fighting.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the insight on that. I want to talk about maybe Russia's next move and Ukraine's next defense. You and Scott Ritter have brought to people's attention that Russia has now upped their game. They are pumping out equipment and munitions 24 hours a day. They're building up anywhere from 300,000 to 500,000 soldiers. What do you think is Russia's next move? What do you think is Ukraine's counter move?
Well, first of all, the Ukrainians are in a difficult position because they've already exhausted most of their reserves and their manpower on these pointless counterattacks against Russian defenders in southern Ukraine. The Russians went to what I would call an economy of force mission. They pulled in their horns, they consolidated in a smaller area, they built defenses, and then invited the Ukrainians to attack them. It's turned into a wonderful outcome for the Russians because the Russians have inflicted enormous losses on the Ukrainians to the point where Ukraine has really bled white. Now they're forcing old men, women, boys into uniform to try and fill the ranks. And as I think a former Marine who is currently fighting with the Ukrainians as part of their so-called Foreign Legion pointed out to several journalists, life expectancy on the front in Bakhmut, which has been the center of much of the fighting, is about 4 hours if you're a new recruit in the Ukrainian army. So this has been a disaster for the Ukrainians. Meanwhile, I think Zelensky and his friends have determined that we have to keep dying in great numbers to persuade the United States and the Western allies that we're a good investment. I don't think that's worked very well. I think the opposite has ultimately occurred. And people now realize Ukrainians have no chance whatsoever of winning. The question is, what can they do? And we're going to try and provide them additional equipment, and we're going to scrape the bottom of the barrel and keep hurling them at the Russians. Now, in the meantime, the Russians have taken comparatively few losses. I said that I thought they'd lost 20 to 25,000 killed and perhaps 40 or 50,000 wounded. There are others out there who say I'm over the top, that in fact the losses are much lower. Now keep in mind that the Russians, when they inflict casualties, most of those casualties are inflicted by artillery systems, rockets, missiles, hard shell ammunition. They can fire thousands and thousands of rounds every day. The Ukrainians cannot. They don't have the ammunition. And all of the artillery systems are much more accurate because of these quadcopters, these small UAVs that fly over the battlefield that are linked to GPS and satellites and immediately transmit the firing data to the batteries. And this has just been devastating to the Ukrainians. The rapidity with which these standoff attack weapons can respond is really phenomenal. I think the Ukrainians now are not going to be able to do very much except fall back to new defensive positions, hope for the best. And the Russians are going to decide when they think they have enough artillery munitions on hand, and that's one of the things they've been doing, building up their stockpiles, because the last thing that you want once you embark in a battle is to discover that you don't have enough ammunition. If you want to fire 10, 15, 20, 30,000 rounds a day against your potential opponent in order to keep your casualties down, you got to have a lot of ammunition. So I think there's been a pause in January, not a pause on the battlefield, but with the senior officer said, wait a minute, we're not sure we have enough ammunition for what we want to do in the future. So I think that's part of the reason they've waited. The second part is to see what we do. I think Putin regards us as, in addition to being deceitful and untruthful with him, he also thinks that this administration is dangerous insofar as it's unpredictable and impulsive, that we could impulsively do things that could be dangerous to Russia. He now sees the war as not so much a war for Ukraine or for Eastern Ukraine or part of Ukraine. He sees this as an existential war for Russia's survival because of all the things that Biden and his friends have been saying about him and Russia. And again, remember, Putin has enormous support in the Russian population. If anything, the Russians are impatient with the way he's handled the conflict. They want him to go in and simply bludgeon everybody in sight and smash Ukraine. He has always been reluctant to do that. He also has another audience that we don't think about. The audience in Africa, Latin America, South Asia, Southeast Asia, China. And all of these states are increasingly sympathetic to him, not us. Okay. And he doesn't want to lose their support. And he'll lose that if he is seen as sort of ham-handedly butchering vast numbers of Ukrainians.
Okay, so on the one hand, he doesn't just want to go in super heavy-handed and, destroy them, annihilate them, because he'll lose that support. On the other side, if he isn't doing something, he loses the support of the Russian people. And maybe there's a coup attempt or something like that.
I think the coup attempt is nonsense. I don't think there's any danger to Putin at all. I think he's got a government that is firmly behind him and the population is firmly behind him. Anybody who tries to harm Putin will probably be killed 2 or 3 miles away from the Kremlin before they get any closer. So this is just nonsense. All this business that you hear about, oh, well, Russia's weak and there's internal, that's all nonsense. Just write it off. I saw an article yesterday saying that there were people planning on marching on the Kremlin, and it turned out the man represented a party that in the last election got 0.5% of the vote. Come on. The West just publishes garbage about Russia on a scale we can't even begin to imagine.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's interesting. Okay. In our last interview, we got 1.6 million listeners. Very good feedback. One of the things that you had mentioned and that I saw in the comments is you mentioned something about biolabs in Ukraine. You said that's a whole different video or interview. What did you mean by that?
Well, there was something in the neighborhood of 25 or 26 biological laboratories in Ukraine, many of them in very close proximity to Belarus and the Russian border. Some of those have been taken over, obviously, by the Russians. They've gone in there, they've gotten control of what was there. There's a lot of evidence, I'm told, for work on biowarfare, even genetic work that was designed to target Slavic peoples, specifically the Slavic population in Russia. This is very disturbing stuff. We don't allow this in the United States. It's against the law. But we have been involved in similar laboratories in China and overseas. I mean, everyone who talks about the Chinese invented the evil coronavirus, what they don't bother to point out is that the Chinese were working in our labs in North Carolina when the Obama administration discovered this gain of function work and said, that's against the law, you can't do it here. So they made provisions to move it to China. And the laboratory that was picked is the one that lost control of the virus, or so we think. And I think that's probably true. And we also knew that it was not a level 4 lab, contrary to popular belief, that there were no level 4 labs available in China. The best that could be hoped for was level 3, but we went ahead anyway. We paid for the research and sent the scientists over there. We have a similar situation in Ukraine. It's the Wild West, and has been for some time, hopelessly corrupt. You can get just about anything you want for money. For instance, we know there are between 50 and 60,000 Ukrainian children that have gone missing since this war began. We can only begin to imagine the horrors those children must be facing. I mean, Ukraine is not a normal country as we understand it. and it's weaker now and more confused and chaotic now than ever. So these laboratories seem to have represented a real threat to the Russians. And that's one of the things that the Russians have wasted no time examining and exploring. I don't know all the details. What I've told you is about all that I know. How much Hunter Biden and other members of the family were involved with this, I have no idea. But again, the opportunity to stick your hand in somebody's pocket in Ukraine and pull cash out is just limitless.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I remember Victoria Nuland testifying under oath within the last few months, and Senator Marco Rubio kind of set her up saying, you know, okay, so these do exist, but if something were to leak out of them or go wrong, that would be Russia's fault, right? Like immediately setting Russia up, even though they're, you know, keeping that information under lock and key heavily.
Yeah, listen, all of these people have been economical with the truth from the very beginning. Almost nothing that the American people in the West have been told about this war is accurate. So, you know, here we are, and you've got Mr. Putin has concluded, and most of the Russians have, that our goal is the destruction of his country, not just his removal, but its destruction and its dismemberment. We've got lots of people in Washington talking openly about that, whether it's Lindsey Graham or anybody else. Remember, Russia is rich in resources. There are lots of people who would like to get involved with it and rape the place and take whatever they can and profit from it. This is essentially the environment in which Putin rose to the presidency. When he came to the presidency, Russia was prostrate. It was lying on its back, being butchered by everyone in sight. Many of those people are now in New York City and London. And Putin either booted them out or they left before they could be arrested and punished. This is an ugly story. There are reasons why these things are happening, and most of them have nothing to do with liberal democracy or our supposed values, whatever they are, since we continually ignore international law whenever it suits us to do so.
Colonel Macgregor, I know we don't directly have U.S. military boots on the ground yet, and Ukraine is essentially leaning heavily on U.S. military intel. But is Zelensky a good wartime leader? Meaning, does he have good generals and colonels around him, or is he just a former sitcom actor relying heavily on the United States and NATO?
Well, I think the last point is accurate, but he was recruited by this oligarch Kolomoisky, who is also the man that has funded these neo-Nazi units that have been guilty of terrible crimes against captured Russian troops and civilians, and are still committing crimes every day in Ukraine, threatening and murdering people that do not or will not support Zelensky and his regime. Zelensky himself was picked because he was an actor, and he's done a brilliant job of acting. Is there any depth of understanding? Of course not. Now, whether or not his officers are any good, that's very much open to dispute. After all, most of these people, when they were finally selected, they spent a lot of time being trained and educated by us. You know, one of the things that worried me from the very beginning was this light infantry-centric mentality in the U.S. and British armies. And the reason I worried about it was that I was afraid that tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers would be lost in urban areas. Because the Russians aren't fools, in most cases, they're not going to bother digging people out of these areas. They'll simply lay siege to them, which is exactly what happened in a place like Mariupol. And thousands of good Ukrainian troops were lost because they were simply captured ultimately, or slowly ground into bits. But I think there was a lot of bad thinking and bad tactical advice. And under the circumstances, I think the Ukrainians did the best job that they could. But the point is, I don't think we can really evaluate it in great detail because it's always a mix. You're always going to have some people at the top who are good and some who are not. And right now, the people that are retained and being trusted by Zelensky are the yes men, the people who unconditionally do whatever he tells them to do. And remember, he's got this neo-Nazi force inside the country, ensuring that people obey his orders. Now, as far as the manpower goes, the NATO military manpower has increased dramatically. We have good sources that suggest there are at least 20,000 Polish soldiers in Ukrainian uniform. And the Russians listen to Polish spoken on the radios and in combat all the time. You have to add to those some unknown number of mercenaries, many of whom are former U.S. soldiers. And then you have people that are there as quote unquote contractors. You know, this is an Austrian colonel pointed out in an interview quite recently. I think his name is Liesner, something like that. He said, if I take my uniform off tomorrow and I put on the Ukrainian uniform, then I'm no longer a member of NATO and serving in the Austrian army. I'm fighting for Ukraine. Well, good luck with that, because if he's captured by the Russians, they can execute him. He has no protection under the Geneva Convention. None of these foreigners in Ukrainian uniform or nondescript uniform will be safe. Then we have lots of people on the ground that are operating, as you point out, as extensions of our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance community. The Ukrainians have the benefit of some of the best information and intelligence in the world that we transmit immediately. The problem for the Ukrainians is they can't always act on it.
Okay. Thank you for that. I don't know how much you know about this, but it's been coming out more and more that Zelensky is having to cut ties with people high up in the Ukrainian government because of corruption and stealing money. I read recently that around $100 billion from United States taxpayer money has been put up for this war. And they believe anywhere from 30 to 50% of that money is just being eaten up in money laundering and Ukrainian corruption. I also read that only about 1/3 of U.S. military weaponry that's being sent over is ending up on the front lines. The rest is being taken, sold on the black market, or even ending up in the hands of the Russian, soldiers that are fighting. Have you heard any of this? What do you know about this?
Well, I know that the Caesar artillery system that France provided to the Ukrainians, that at least one of those systems, and I've forgotten how many they provided, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 or 20. These are large gun systems, very accurate, rapid fire, that at least one of them was directly sold to the Russians on the battlefield by Ukrainians. So there's clearly truth in what you're saying, but when we start talking about percentages, we don't know. We all know that Zelensky and his inner circle have fat bank accounts in Cyprus. We know that Zelensky and his friends own property in the West. I'm sure that when this is over, long before anybody gets to Zelensky, either the Ukrainians that want to kill him or the Russians that want to kill him, he'll probably escape to the West. He may well end up in the United States or somewhere else in elaborate surroundings. I mean, this has happened before. Karzai's brother from Afghanistan has a 23-room bathroom mansion in Maryland somewhere. How does this happen? Well, it happens because of the widespread corruption and pilfering of dollars. When you turn on the faucet and you just pour money into any place, you're going to corrupt the place. And that's what we've done in virtually everywhere we've gone. We deform the economy and we corrupt it. Not intentionally. It's an unavoidable outcome.
Okay. Yeah. I remember reading the former president of Afghanistan left with like a carload full of American money and was able to escape with his life, right? Let's switch gears for 1 minute.
Well, before we leave that, just to point out that you could see members of the Ukrainian cabinet, the Zelensky government, traveling back and forth between Kiev and the Polish border in their Porsches and their Mercedes and BMWs.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. I appreciate the insight. That's why I have you on. Just real quickly on Afghanistan. The U.S. media has essentially done a blackout on the United States pulling out of Afghanistan. I remember seeing the picture of President Biden looking very frail, by himself, not surrounded by his board. Is there ever going to be any accountability for the way that we withdrew from Afghanistan, or has the media moved on in order to cover for a sitting president?
All of the above. There are lots of people on both sides of the aisle that profited from Afghanistan, just as they are profiting from the debacle in Ukraine. there is very little interest on the Hill in pressing this issue of accountability, because if you live in a glass house, throwing stones is dangerous. So I don't expect much accountability to come about as a result of anything Congress undertakes. There are very few people up there, in my judgment, that Americans would genuinely approve of if they knew anything about them. I wish people would pay more attention to where the money goes in Washington, D.C., because that explains many of our policies that most Americans on any given day would not support. So I think we need to understand something, that when President Trump took office in the summer of 2017, he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. When he announced that and insisted, that's what I want out, he was stonewalled by virtually everybody in his administration, with the exception of Steve Bannon and the man who became the Attorney General, Jeffries. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank.
It's okay.
But Bannon was a stalwart for Trump and said, yes, we got to get out. All of the retired generals, acting generals, most of his staff said, oh, no, you can't just leave. If you leave, everything will fall apart. Well, it didn't matter when we left, Steve. We could have left 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Didn't matter. It was always going to fall apart. You know, what people in that part of the world don't build for themselves does not survive the departure of foreign military power. We went into Iraq and Afghanistan, these places, essentially said, you can all go home now. We're in charge. We'll tell you who we want in charge and how to do it. And we're going to rebuild everything and turn you into this gleaming city on a hill, a liberal democracy like the West. Well, this is all nonsense. It never had any chance of success. You created the corruption problem. So Donald Trump understood that. He wanted out. He didn't know how to get out. And he took time. He refused to fire people. You know, thank you, General, for your interest in national defense. We're getting out of Afghanistan. You're fired. Didn't do it. He let this drag on and drag on and drag on. Finally, towards the end of his administration, you know, he's frustrated. He recognizes that many of the things he wanted to achieve, he hadn't. He'd been subverted left and right by everybody inside his own administration. I and others who had not previously held any positions were brought in, and he made it very clear that he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. And that's how I was brought into the equation. I was handed a note from the president, and I knew from my discussions with the president, he wanted out, no question about it. I knew from my discussions in the building and with everybody in uniform that spent any time in Afghanistan that the time to leave was midwinter. That was the best time to go, because most of your opponents, your potential adversaries, were sitting next to a heater, a stove, or a fire somewhere in the mountains. People were not going to come out and fight with you at that time of year. It wasn't part of what they call the fighting season. And we knew it wouldn't be easy, but we knew it could be done. And so he said, write an order and I'll sign it. I wrote an order. Subsequently, the order was changed. It was massaged and so forth. He writes it. And of course, immediately everyone is up in arms. Oh, you can't do this. If you do this, the world will end. You know, we can't possibly just leave. And so what did we do? We waited until the summer, the worst time of year to leave, when the enemy is plentiful in abundance and ready to halt and interfere with you. We tried to negotiate a deal with them. And instead of systematically removing billions of dollars of useful equipment, or at least if we couldn't remove it all, destroying what remained, you see what happened. We just walked out. We abandoned everything. The same generals who were there under Trump, who subverted him, were still there under President Biden. And what did they do? They did a terrible job. This is this man, McKenzie, who was in CENTCOM, Milley, who was the chairman. Look at all the individuals that were involved in this sort of thing, and it was a catastrophe because everyone wanted to stay forever. Politicians find comfort in the presence of U.S. forces, even if the U.S. forces are failing, even if they're taking casualties, as long as they are not held responsible for the debacle. So what happens is that we stayed, and we stayed, and we stayed. And there were lots of four-star generals ready to step forward and say, well, we are making progress. We have done well here and here and here. When in reality, we know we weren't making any progress. It was chipping away at the Rock of Gibraltar. We should have gotten out of there 20 years ago. We didn't need to be in that country for more than 6 months. But again, you got all the way back, and remember, we didn't get Osama bin Laden and his little band. So the first person that made the first gargantuan error that failed in that mission, and remember, you're talking about the United States military surveillance state, the National Security Agency, the CIA, the Special Operations Command, places where we invest hundreds of billions of dollars, and we can't even bring to justice one man and a group of perhaps 300 or 400 stalwart supporters. This is back in 1997, or excuse me, not 97, back in 2001 and 2002. Did we hold General Franks responsible for that failure? He was given the mission. It was his task. Did we do anything to him? No. And so you have this cascading effect, a series of general officers who come in. Some do well, some don't. There is no accountability. No one has stood up and said, you failed, you're out. And again, the politicians don't want to do that. They're all very reluctant to do anything because almost none of them have spent any time in uniform. And virtually none of them have ever been in action or seen any real action. So they all feel uncomfortable. We used to have this problem with the so-called Vietnam draft dodgers like Mr. Biden. Now we have it with all of these people who've never really served and done anything. Oh, I don't think I'm comfortable doing that to the general. And they look at these officers that have vast medals on their chests, and they don't realize none of them mean a damn thing. They're all thank you for coming medals. It's rare that you see anything for valor under fire. And those are the only things that count. What a soldier does under fire is what's meaningful. Everything else is nonsense, frankly speaking, because everything else is designed to prepare him to fight. So, make a long story short, no, there's not going to be any accountability in the near term. And I think we're going to continue to act like, well, I'm sorry, that's the way it goes. We did the best we could, and so we lost $80 billion, and so we funded the Islamist terrorists for several more years. And to go back to your original question, yes, American weapons are being resold in Kosovo, which is another gleaming pearl of success. And they're finding their way into Iraq and into Syria and into North Africa and down into Central Africa. Of course. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. One comment and then our final question. I appreciate your time.
Sure.
Do members of DC politics, there's something called stolen valor, where people dress up and pretend to be veterans or active duty people in order to get money. I think it's disgusting. Do you think, it seems like just based on what you said, some of these politicians are exercising stolen valor where they take comfort in knowing that they've got men and women in uniform guarding a post and that they're the money person making sure that you're taken care of. And yet then they hide behind that military power and that military presence. To me, this almost seems like stolen valor where they're putting up the money, but it's not even their money. And yet they take pride in the U.S. military, but they don't stand a post.
Well, I think that's true. There's no question about it. We have to understand that our government is the best government money can buy. I mean, I listen to people say, oh, China's the new threat. We have to defeat China. Well, first of all, China is not, in military terms, threatening us at all. It's not attacking us, never has. Well, why are we suddenly concerned about China if China really is not militarily engaged in direct action against us, nor will it, in my judgment? Well, follow the money. As Russia winds down, it becomes clear we're not going to win anything in Ukraine. How do you continue to line your pockets if you can't continue to spend money on defense? I mean, defense is one of these things where if you're not careful, someone will wake up and decide, well, the real threats to this country are in the Western Hemisphere. They come from the Caribbean Basin and Mexico. Well, nobody's terribly excited about that because that doesn't justify massive expenditures on the scale of the current defense budget. It's very inexpensive to close your border. It's inexpensive to get control of immigration. Much less expensive to go into cities and restore the rule of law. But no one's really interested in doing that. So we let the country bleed and hemorrhage, while at the same time we're pouring money into this place called Ukraine, which is a corrupt black hole. Well, that's because people are profiting from it. And you can see the homes and where they live and how they're enjoying life as a result. Americans need to wake up. That's what I really got to say. Americans have been too complacent, Steve, for too long. They have to understand that no one is coming to save them. If you don't like where the economy is headed, if you don't like the things we're doing, then it's time for you to get involved. And your anger has to be translated into some sort of action that compels performance. I haven't seen that yet. And until we see that, nothing will change.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Final question, then I'll let you go. Is Washington, D.C. ever going to seek peace and arrange an opportunity to sit down with Putin? Or is the game plan to just throw money at this until Ukraine decides what is peace? And does Ukraine even have an opportunity of winning at this point?
No, Ukraine never did. It's just that Russia did not treat Ukraine as a serious opponent. And I don't think Mr. Putin ever thought in his wildest dreams that we would do what we have done in that country to keep this war going. So the answer is Ukraine is probably the last to know and has almost no impact whatsoever on this. Remember, they're down to 18 to 22 million people from a population that a year ago was 37.4 million. This is a government that's a runaway train called the Zelensky regime, doing all sorts of things that no one in this country would approve of under normal circumstances. So no, I don't think that has much to do with it. I think, again, we'll do what we did after Vietnam. Well, we pushed the remaining equipment that we didn't think was worth anything into the South China Sea, and we sailed away. And nobody talked about it much anymore. We killed 2 million Vietnamese. We lost 58,000 dead. Well, the Ukrainians have already lost much more than in the last year than we ever lost in Vietnam. But what happened to the 2 million Vietnamese dead? Well, we didn't admit to it until many, many decades later. In fact, I think we said, oh, maybe we killed a couple of 100,000. We just walk away. Remember, we are primarily an aerospace or maritime power. We are not a land power anywhere except in our own hemisphere. So we always have the opportunity when things don't go our way to get on board the aircraft or get on board ship and leave. And the American people have proven repeatedly they have very short memories. And you change the subject and you tell the media to stop talking about it. And if the media doesn't talk about it, well, you go back home to your Barca lounge, you open your can of beer and you watch cable TV. That's what they depend on, the people in Washington. That's what they bet on, that no one will pay any attention. This time, I think it's going to be different because I think Russia is not Serbia. Russia is not Iraq. We are not going to defeat Russia. Russia will have its way in Ukraine. Russia will annihilate the Ukrainian armed forces. This regime will not survive. And as a result, NATO won't survive. NATO will crumble because people in Europe will finally recognize what we've been doing. Waging war overseas at great expense to them and at the expense of their national interests, at the expense of their security, and that Mr. Putin is not Dr. Evil and has no interest in waging war against the rest of Europe. On the contrary, he wants to do business with them. And the Chinese want to get across Central Asia because you want your rail lines to link you in China to railheads in Europe so goods and services can be moved back and forth. You got to have peace and stability for that. Russia has been providing the peace and stability by bolstering people in Central Asia, keeping that place running effectively so the Chinese can build this one belt, one road. We don't want that to succeed. The way to stop this successful trade route is to do what? Create instability and war. The Chinese lose in our estimation and the Russians lose, but in the long run, no. Central Asia is going to be stable. In the long run, those lines are going to open. That trade will occur. We're fighting the inevitable pointlessly, when instead we should be looking at ways to capitalize on it ourselves, to work with the rest of the world. We are seen as people who are completely selfish, completely self-interested, no sympathy for or interested in anybody other than ourselves. That's a very bad reputation to have. Remarkably different from the way the world viewed us 50 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and from what we've discussed today, Germany may be the first one to wake up and say, we can't be, funding all of your wars, and we need Putin for that energy. And they that may be the turning point, because as you mentioned, Berlin, 50,000 people protesting, end this war, end this war. They may be the first one to get it to go their way.
Well, we'll see. I think something is going to happen that will change conditions over there. The Europeans are the ones that are going to have to stand up and say, thank you, but no thank you. But we got to stop this obsession with this man, Putin. We're dealing with the Russian people and the Russian state. We act as though he's the single link in the great chain of evil. That's a lot of nonsense. There's no chain of evil. You can't threaten an entire nation of people with destruction and expect them to sit down with you and talk to you. I don't think Putin will talk to anybody in Washington right now. He won't talk to anybody here until this administration is gone. And I think his view of Western Europe is very similar. You've all lied to me. You haven't told us the truth. The Minsk Accords were a facade, a joke. So don't expect us to sit down and have tea with you and entertain any thoughts or ideas you may have. He'll wait until there's new leadership in Europe. And that's coming.
Okay. Yeah. I'll let you go here, but Judge Andrew Napolitano mentioned to me that it seems like there is bad blood between Putin and Joe Biden, and that may be driving more of this than we know, but maybe that's for a different discussion.
No, we got to get out of this petty personality nonsense. It's all about interests, strategic interests. It's not, do I like Miss So-and-so who is prime minister, or Mr. So-and-so who is the current chancellor of Germany. It has nothing to do with that. What are Germany's interests? What are Russia's interests? What are our interests? We tend to define our interests in any way we like because we don't live in Europe.
Yeah.
We don't live in Asia. So we just make our minds, oh, well, this week, this is important to us. Next week, that may not be important anymore. But for the people that live in Europe and Asia, that live with China and Russia, that's unacceptable. Their interests are relatively permanent. If you sit in Berlin today and you look east, your views are not terribly dissimilar from the views that were held 100 or 200 years ago. You're interested in the same kind of terms of trade that will boost prosperity and maintain stability. The good thing, what has really changed, is Europeans and most people in Asia are completely disinterested in going to war. They've had enough. We're the ones that keep talking about war, war, war. Yet we do nothing to protect our borders. We do nothing to protect our country. We leave our intellectual property on the table to be stolen. We ship our industries overseas. China did not rob us of our manufacturing base. We robbed ourselves of it. Greedy people in Washington and the corporate sector shipped those things out. This is what people have to get through their heads. Stop looking overseas for someone to blame for the misery that we confront today at home. We are the authors of our own mess, and those authors are principally in Washington and in the corporate sector. Americans need to wake up. That's the problem. It's not in Beijing. It's not in Moscow. It's here.
Right. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your service to our country. And I will definitely have you back on the show. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, so there's a lot going on in the Russia-Ukraine war, and the mainstream media spins it one way, independent journalists spin it another. I have with me today Colonel Douglas Macgregor to get to the bottom of what's really going on and filter that through a brilliant military mind. Colonel Macgregor, thank you so much for being on today's show.
Sure.
So over the weekend, President Biden confirmed to Ukraine and the other G7 nations that the United States would be offering F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. How wise or dangerous is this move?
Well, your viewers naturally have seen the president state initially what he would not send, and then subsequently backtrack down the line and say, I will send it. I think that we're seeing this happen again with fourth generation aircraft, the F-16. The truth of the matter is the reason he keeps backtracking is that things in Ukraine get worse. Ukrainians are losing more soldiers. Their infrastructure is being destroyed. They're in very bad shape. And so under the circumstances, what you refused to send previously, you now send as a matter of desperation. The problem with the F-16 is twofold. First of all, I don't know how many people they're going to find to fly this anytime soon. Now, what has always concerned me and should concern Americans is the predisposition to put American pilots into those aircraft and fly them in support of the Ukrainians. Now, undoubtedly, that would be a question of calling for volunteers or bringing someone who's recently retired back to do it. The problem with that is that these are then mercenaries, and they are not covered under the Geneva Convention. In other words, they're simply fighters for hire. And that's a serious problem. What do you do if you lose one of these aircraft? And then finally, I think as things get worse, and they're very bad now, and they're only going to get worse, we're back to the temptation to find ways to intervene in Western Ukraine. As it becomes clear this Ukrainian state apparatus is collapsing. And remember, we own it. We pay for everything. We own the government. We're keeping the economy going. We're paying the troops, the bureaucrats, everything. So once that weakens, I mean, the whole thing is going to fall like a house of cards. So I worry that someone will say, well, let's go in, with our own forces. The Russians wouldn't dare to challenge us. And of course, they're wrong. I think for many Russians who are extremely angry with us and the terrible damage that we have caused them by turning Ukraine into this platform for attack against Russia, they would welcome the opportunity to crush any U.S. forces that intervened, or for that matter, any NATO forces that did. So I hope we put that out of our minds, but I worry about that.
Would that be like a coalition of nations, or specifically like Poland, or who do you think might make a move? And could they justify, like Poland, saying, hey, this used to be our territory anyway, we're kind of just taking it back now that Ukraine can't stand on its own two legs?
Well, everybody in Eastern Europe can make that assertion and have some credibility. I mean, if you go to this thing they call Kaliningrad, which is the very corner of East Prussia, that was German from about 1220 onwards. So you're talking, 850 years nonstop German. It's now part of Russia, thanks to FDR. Stalin, as his armies moved west, said, hey, we'd really like to have that port in the Baltic. Do you have any objections? And FDR said, no, of course not, Joe, take it. So now we have Russians sitting there where no one in their right mind wanted them. But the bottom line is that, sure, you can always find the Hungarians, the Poles, any numbers of people that have controlled territory that's now under somebody else's authority. So that's part of it. But I think the bigger issue is this. Whenever we go anywhere, we always go as a quote-unquote coalition. We have that as the fig leaf of legitimacy. But the truth is that other than the Poles, maybe some Romanians, although I have my doubts, and maybe a few Brits, the United States is going to be on its own if it goes into Western Ukraine. Now, it could be some of the Lithuanians want to go along. I don't know. That could be. But even in Poland, the enthusiasm for this fiasco is waning. The most recent polling data says that the Poles are tired of being overwhelmed by Ukrainian refugees. They're openly talking about the Ukrainianization of their country, which they dislike intensely. And the Polish chief of staff has said, look, the Russians are not incompetent. They're tough soldiers. They're very competent. They know what they're doing. So I see evidence that people are sobering up. The question is, will we sober up? And I don't see any evidence for it. Just as you have people that absolutely refuse in Washington to believe that there could be a serious economic turndown. In other words, that there is a cost associated with money printing and tightening credit and rising interest rates. You can also find lots of people in Washington say, oh, the Russians are nothing. We're everything. We're invincible, invulnerable. It's very dangerous. So I see that here. I don't know how deeply that runs, but if you looked at some of the more recent articles that have come out, there's a lot of evidence that what I would call common sense and reality, those things don't really intrude very much at the highest levels of the Biden administration.
Yeah. Well, if Europe doesn't make a move, we sure know that Wall Street is going to make a move. BlackRock is already meeting with Zelensky and talking about how they can, revitalize, bring life back, and how there's just so much money to be made. And I find it disgusting how, they look at this as just such a great money-making opportunity when there's human life on the line.
Well, remember, the people that you're talking about here in Washington, or the financiers in Europe and the United States, whether it's Soros or Larry Fink at BlackRock, they're not interested in Ukrainians. They could care less. They have been very hopeful that Russia could be destroyed so that they could strip Russia of its resources. Remember, you're talking about an area from sort of the middle of Ukraine all the way to Kamchatka, the peninsula, that is full of extraordinary resources. Everything from gold mines to extraordinarily rare minerals and rare earths and endless quantities of fresh water, wonderful soil, an abundance of food. We could go on and on and on. So I think that's really been behind much of what we see in this sort of proxy war waged against Russia. Now, I don't see any evidence that Russia is going to collapse, and I think Putin will probably be president long after Biden has vanished from the scene. But it's still dangerous, and we'll have to see what happens to the rest of Ukraine. But you've just hit on a very important point that all the people viewing this should keep in mind. If you're a Russian right now and you look at the situation, you've taken, contrary to what the mainstream media says, comparatively few casualties. I mean, you have an exchange rate of about 1 Russian killed for every 7 Ukrainians killed. So that's a pretty favorable ratio. Nobody likes to lose anybody in war, but that's a good position to be in. Just as Ukraine is now scraping the bottom of the barrel, running out of manpower, they're actually dragging back about 30 to 35,000 Ukrainians training in Germany, Canada, the United States, the Czech Republic, other places, back to Ukraine to become the foundation for this so-called counteroffensive that they want to, execute. And the rest of them, though, unfortunately, are just being shanghaied into the military. You're talking about a lot of young boys, a lot of old men, and so forth. Russia's in a different position. Russia's stronger than ever. Russia is actually peaking in its capability. If you look at its forces, they've really learned a great deal over the last year plus. In other words, if we look at the initial Russian forces that went in, like any army that has not seen action for a very long time, they made mistakes. But they learned from those mistakes. And there's a great report out from the Royal United Services Institute. It still has stupid things in it about the Russians lacking initiative and all that, but brush that aside and just look at what they talk about in terms of adaptation and innovation. And you see that the Russians have really produced a very, very fine force. And they're better now than they've ever been, and they're larger now than they've ever been, and they have more modern equipment, more experience. So when they are finally released and allowed to execute, and I think they're waiting for the Ukrainians to sort of exhaust the last forces at their disposal on another pointless counterattack. Once that happens, they're in the driver's seat. So why would they sit idly by and allow us to intervene, or even worse, bother to negotiate with us? The Politico article that came out over the weekend said that behind the scenes in Washington, the Biden administration, White House, State Department, people are now talking about a frozen conflict as the best outcome. Now think about that. These are people in Washington who want to turn Ukraine into Korea, create a DMZ, and of course then they want to park their forces in Western Ukraine on the other side of the Dnieper River, staring at the Russians. Or better yet, if the Russians would accept such a thing, they'll cross the river up in northern Ukraine and sit there. Russians will never accept that. It's out of the question. They have been fighting to demilitarize Ukraine, eliminate the armed forces there that threaten them, and then secondly, they want this place to be neutral. So the idea that these people at the top could look forward to some sort of Korea-like division of Ukraine and that they might be satisfied with that is a manifestation of how utterly uninformed and ridiculous they are. It just makes no sense. They're not listening to the Russians. They're not acknowledging reality.
Well, they're still trying to push this narrative that this was an unprovoked attack versus a decade of building up and provoking Putin to the point where he felt like my only option is to create this buffer zone. And unfortunately, Ukraine has to become that buffer zone. Let's move on to Bakhmut for a minute. Russia says Bakhmut has fallen. Zelensky says, no, it hasn't. We still have soldiers in the area fighting. And until we run out of bodies, this area is not taken. How does the battle for Bakhmut show how military strategies and goals can change over time? And in your opinion, has Bakhmut fallen into the hands of Russia?
Well, Bakhmut, 90% of it has been in Russian hands now for months. It's only this small sliver of land on the very edge that remained in Ukrainian hands. And they occupied some concrete reinforced buildings, very large, sort of high-rise-like buildings. And the Russians were very reluctant to destroy them because they had information that there were Russian civilians in the basements. We have to understand that you're operating in a part of Ukraine where the population is really Russian. Now, they may have been Ukrainian citizens, but of course, Ukrainians treated them badly, didn't allow them to speak their language, have their schools, worship as they saw fit. They did not have equal rights before the law. They were an oppressed minority. And every time someone that was Russian would complain, look, I'm a Ukrainian citizen. I'm happy to do whatever. Just give me my equal rights. They said, well, there's a country. It's called Russia. You can leave here and go there. So the Russians did not want to kill large numbers of Russian civilians in eastern Ukraine. That slows everything down. It has slowed everything down from the beginning. People don't get it. That's been a major constraint on the conduct of Russian military operations. Secondly, they then saw virtue in necessity to some extent. Remember, Surovikin comes in. He's from the aerospace forces. He takes over the theater in the fall, completely changes the chain of command, streamlines it, creates unity of command. And he decides that as long as the Russians are building up their forces for future operations against Ukrainians, that he's going to run now what I would call a relatively elastic defense, an economy of force operation. In other words, to use minimal force to maintain control of the areas that the Russians have, while at the same time enticing the Ukrainians in to fight, inviting them in essentially to attack. Bakhmut suddenly became very attractive to him. We now know from what Mr. Prigozhin has said and other Russian sources have said that he deliberately used Bakhmut as sort of a red flag for the Ukrainian bull and kept those roads open and the opportunity for Ukrainians to reinforce it. Now, we see a lot of evidence that upwards of 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in and around Bakhmut. That's a huge number of people. We know at least that many were wounded. The bad news with a lot of the Ukrainian wounded is that they never returned to duty. So the Russians have been pretty good at getting somewhere around 70 to 80% of their soldiers back to the front lines after a couple of months of recuperation. The Ukrainians have been unable to do that for a whole range of reasons. So the losses were really staggering. And I think it is not an exaggeration to suggest that Bakhmut really is the graveyard of the Ukrainian army. And Zelensky's obsession with Bakhmut is on par with Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad. And what people don't understand is that the Germans didn't have to have or occupy or control Stalingrad. Long before the Sixth Army even arrived on the Volga River, the only thing of value in Stalingrad was an aircraft factory, a place where the Russians were literally building fighters. That was destroyed by the German Air Force. There was really no reason to, overreach with your forces and go that far east. But then Hitler did it. He was sort of attracted to this. Well, it's called Stalingrad. So this is a kind of strategic grudge match with Stalin. And Stalin, said, we're not leaving Stalingrad, and fed more and more and more troops in there. Of course, the difference was that he could afford 1 million casualties. The Germans could not. So the bottom line is Zelensky has treated Bakhmut in the same way. It becomes the symbol of Ukrainian resistance. And I think we are probably equally guilty of encouraging him to do that. And instead of being a symbol of resistance, it was just a sponge for blood. And that's why, I think in retrospect, 2, 3, 4 years from now, people will look back on this war and they will say, well, Bakhmut was a huge turning point because the Ukrainians couldn't replace their losses. They couldn't replace all the equipment losses. And the Russians took very few casualties and lost almost no equipment. The outcome was a catastrophe for Ukraine. And I think that's pretty clear. But of course, the mainstream media has its script. They're going to continue to read from it. They're not going to tell you the truth. And until you have, I really say this all the time, and it's depressing to me, but I guess until you have Russian forces on the west side of the Dnieper and they overrun Odessa and they move north and take Kharkov, people will finally recognize, my goodness, what happened to the great victory? What happened to the inevitable Ukrainian success story? Then maybe people will wise up.
Yeah.
I do.
Bakhmut, in the beginning was like a beacon of hope. This will decide the war, and then as they began to lose, top military in the United States began to say, "Oh, this is just one of many cities, one of many battles." But as you say, it stopped being a symbol of hope and has become a sponge for blood. The Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orbán, he has said that NATO now needs to start pushing for peace. Many of the top nations have balked at his comments. Do you think it's because these NATO leaders believe that going for peace would be seen as weakness, or worse, as a loss? Or what is the reason to keep pushing at this point?
I think the leadership in Paris, Berlin, and London, as examples, is at least as remote from reality as the Biden administration is. These are, this is your globalist elite, the people that believe in a world that doesn't exist. They think they're fighting Russia because Russia is a nationalist state. They have a national identity, a national language, a national culture. Ergo, we have to destroy it. Remember, these are the people that have been inviting millions from the Middle East and Africa into Europe. They have been welcoming every single potential danger to their society as a returning faith, as something good. In other words, they want to do to Russia what they've already done to Europe, which is severely weaken the place. Look at the economic policies, catastrophic. The Germans just shut down their last nuclear power plant. Well, no matter how much you may not like nuclear power, before you shut all of your plants down, you should have some alternative that works. No, they're shutting everything down, and the alternatives don't work. I mean, if you think you're going to, survive on wind turbines, you've lost your mind. And the lifeblood of all civilizations and successful scientific industrial development is cheap energy. You got to have it. So they've essentially robbed themselves of decades of positive growth and impoverished themselves. This is the elite that thinks it's right and refuses under any circumstances to accept anything else. So they look at what's happening and they say, well, the Russians still haven't moved much further now than they were a few months ago. In other words, the Russians control about 24% of Ukrainian territory. The Russians have never cared about the territory. They care about destroying Ukrainian forces and killing them. They want to demilitarize and, quote unquote, denazify Ukraine. Well, if the Ukrainians are coming to them repeatedly in vast numbers and allowing themselves to be killed, you don't move very much. When that ends, they'll move. maybe then these people in Western Europe will wake up. But, I kind of doubt it. I think they're going to have to be thrown out of office. And if the Europeans don't throw them out, it could be the death of Europe. These people are a catastrophe. They're a disaster. Britain is in just as much, if not more, serious trouble. So, to answer your question, it's an ideological problem. In other words, if you think that you're going to extend with force of arms the LGBTQRSW whatever agenda to Russia that refuses to absorb and adopt your quote unquote new values, instead says, no, we're an Orthodox Christian country. We think there are two genders, men and women. And oh, by the way, we don't marry women to women and men to men. Oh, well, obviously they're committing a terrible sin. They deserve to be destroyed. This is a hopeless endeavor. That's not going to end. In fact, I think the tide of opinion and attitude is actually swinging in Russia's favor in Europe as more and more people look at the, I don't want to say catastrophic, but certainly fragile quality of their civilization and culture. Russia is pointing to it in a different direction and is going to gain, I think, a lot of momentum as a result. I think ultimately the globalists and their neocon friends, who seem to have all sorts of other personal reasons for hating Russia, are on the losing side. But again, it has to be demonstrated clearly, unambiguously for them to admit anything. And even then, they'll probably crawl back under their rocks and wait for the next opportunity. I mean, I grew up during the Vietnam War. And when that thing ended, I could not conceive of any future for the United States in which we repeated the utter folly and stupidity of Vietnam. I'm sorry, but there was no vital strategic interest for the United States in Southeast Asia. In fact, a smart strategist would have stood back and said, well, if the Chinese decide to invade the place, that could be good. They'll overreach. This is what people don't understand. If you go back through history and you look at all the sort of great men of history, whether they're bad or good, doesn't matter. Inevitably, the problem you have is that everybody overreaches. The French overreached, the Spaniards overreached, the British ultimately overreached. We are overreaching. Everyone overreaches. Remember, Einstein said he defined genius as knowing when to stop. Einstein was right. These people don't get it. They don't know when to stop. So it's going to come back to haunt them. It's just a matter of time. And I think the economics at home, and I'm sure you've had other people on, but people really need to listen to this James Ricards. He's absolutely spot on. He's not the only one. There are other sober-minded people out there. The only difference I have with the cash and gold crowd is that I think Bitcoin and digital currency is going to eventually move in and become an enormously important store of value. I don't think it's a temporary phenomenon at all. I think it's a very attractive future for those of us who believe in freedom, because if you want to be free, then you want to be out from underneath the banks.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of money, I asked this to Colonel Tony Shaffer because I've had so many people ask me, why does the United States military budget, why is it over $800 billion? Where does that money go? If we're so far behind on equipment and munitions and things like that, is it just all of the military bases spread across the globe, or where does $800 billion go?
Well, it's actually more than 800 billion now, as you know. And in fact, if you go into the black budget and intelligence, you're way over $1 trillion. And I've always said it's a mistake to look at the defense budget in isolation from the others. There are several things that need to be understood. For a very long time, certainly beginning in the 1960s, Americans were persuaded that if you spent a lot of money on defense, you got lots of defense. Now, let me explain that. In other words, money in equals capability out. That's never been true. All through the 20s and the early 30s, really up until about 1938, the British and the French grossly outspent the Germans. German defense spending did not really begin to rise precipitously until 1938, 39, in the run-up to the war in France and Britain. So you can spend lots of money, and get not very much for your investment. And that's a big problem for us. Why? Well, you've got a lot of people on the Hill that think their job is one and only one thing: spend money. If I were to walk you around the House of Representatives in particular, and I think to a large extent the Senate as well, everybody would tell you, listen, you got to understand something. Our job here is to spend money. That's our job. If we don't spend money, then we don't have a job. Well, that's also tied to re-election and sustaining investments in places and things that benefit your constituents. Also involves spending heavily to benefit your donors. And I like to say that we really have donor government now. You go back to Ralph Nader all through the 90s, he was trying to tell everybody, Washington's occupied territory, the corporations own everything. Well, I would say right now, the donors govern your country. You have open borders. Is that because we all voted on a referendum to open our borders and admit anybody who wants to come in? Of course not. But donors want to do that. Some of those people are involved with the Chamber of Commerce. Some of those are in industries. They want cheap labor. Some of it has to do with corruption and the drug trade and illegal human trafficking, I'm sure, all of those things. So what I'm trying to get across is that the notion that you're spending explicitly for a military capability is false. And here's something else that most viewers just don't get. They don't understand this. We have right now on active duty 44 4-stars, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine. 44 for a force of less than 1.1 million. And by the way, as you all know, we're having trouble recruiting and have had it for quite a while. So during World War II, we had 12.2 million men in uniform at the height of the war. And when we were at 12.2 million, we had 7 4-stars. I mean, I can name them for you: Marshall, MacArthur, Eisenhower, Arnold, King, Nimitz, and I think King, Nimitz, and Leahy. Those 7. That's it. Now, how could we possibly have fought a major war successfully without the help of all those dozens of 4-stars that we now have? Well, look, this is part of the rot, the corruption, the waste. The whole department is a catastrophe. You can't even audit it. You read the recent headline, we found $3 billion that we can ship to Ukraine. Well, the $3 billion aren't going to Ukraine. Some cash will go over there. That does, because you got to pay the government, pay the Ukrainian army, pay for those kinds of things. But most of it just goes from Congress, at least on paper, to the Department of Defense. And that, of course, goes through the Treasury. And then from the Department of Defense, it's recycled back into the defense industries and various contractors. Then it shows up again in the form of donations to political action committees and re-election campaigns and so forth on the Hill. If you want to know why people come to Washington as sort of average middle-class people, and then 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later come out as multimillionaires, there's a reason. We did not create a government that was designed to enrich the people that participate in it. Far from it, but that's what we've got. So you can make a lot of money in Washington, D.C. in government if you're on the right subcommittee, if you have the right donors, if you do the right things. How many times have you heard, well, I'm sorry, I'd like to vote for what you want me to vote for, but I can't do it. Well, why can't you do it? Well, I won't get reelected. Well, what do you mean you won't be reelected? Well, my donors will support my opponent because I have taken a position they don't like and I'll be replaced. That's a hell of a government. It really is. It's a marvelous invention that doesn't make any sense. So our 18th century construct from the 1780s really doesn't work. That's the other revelation that has not yet sunk in. Everybody talks about, the Constitution. Let me tell you, the Bill of Rights is vastly more important. The mechanics of government that we're using today were fine in the late 1700s and probably up until the Civil War. But since then, they've made no sense. I mean, just look at your 50-state construct. Boy, isn't it helpful to have all those states that all have these powers and authorities that can obstruct, stop, whatever you want to do if it's important? In other words, would we be better off with a nation of, say, 5 regions and consolidate a lot of that government and reduce it in size? I mean, there are a lot of things that have to be done, but nothing is going to happen, I think, until there's an enormous economic downturn and a financial crisis. Then we'll begin to see evidence for that. And that goes for foreign policy and domestic policy. You shouldn't see them as totally distinct from each other, because they're not.
Yeah. A hurting wallet makes people behave differently. There's all this talk about central bank digital currency and Bitcoin. I own Bitcoin. I don't know that the government really wants Bitcoin to take off, because it would force them to be honest. I don't think we would be able to have these dark pools of military money and all of this, because there would be a track record of where that money is going in Washington, D.C. And I'm guessing that terrifies them.
Oh, listen, I think you're 100% spot on. By the way, I remember when this whole business got started with the so-called volunteer armed forces. I never considered myself a volunteer. I'm a professional soldier. And so I really dislike the notion of being some volunteer, as though I just show up when there's a fire and otherwise I go about my business. I think the alternative is as follows. The Bitcoin and the digital currency is a promise of freedom from government intrusion, control, and influence. And that influence is obviously linked to the banking system, the financial system. I'm for almost anything that gets the government out of my life as much as possible. But there's another thing. When this volunteer armed forces got started, people said privately, this is a good thing, because now we can do whatever we want with the armed forces. Nobody will pay any attention because we don't have a draft. Now, I have never been a big advocate for the draft in the past. That may have to change in the future. I don't know, but I've never liked it. And I saw the tail end of the draft and the people that were drafted, and they were very miserable and unhappy. And I saw what began to be the foundation for a professional force in the 80s. And that got much better. It was still not, strictly speaking, a real professional force. The most professional people, though, were at the lowest levels. The least professional were at the top. That's still the case, I think, because there's really no compulsion to study your profession. Nobody cares about that. And if you think any of the people that are running the show right now in uniform in the Department of Defense are there because they're just, the best possible soldiers, sailors, airmen, or Marines that you could ever have, you've lost your mind. They're there because they've been put through a political ringer, certainly over the last 30 years, especially over the last 21, 22. Anyone who did not willingly conform, anyone who did not mindlessly embrace whatever dumb ideas and policies came their way, was invited to leave. And people say, well, that's civilian control of the military. No, that's civilian destruction of the military. There's a big difference. Anyone who understands the military understands there are limits to influence on both sides, military and civilian. And what is properly the purview of professional soldiers is not necessarily something for debate by members of the Senate and the House who have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. You might just as well convene a committee on the Hill to discuss the manufacture of microcircuitry and ask them to comment on, how we should approach it and how much money should be invested. They don't know. We have lots of people that don't know, but they make these decisions and influence outcomes. We can't go on like this. So this whole governmental structure, I think, is in trouble. And maybe if there's anything good happening right now, maybe it'll turn us down a different road so that we can reassess the way we do business. But right now, the biggest danger I see is that this crowd in Washington does not understand how dangerous the situation with Russia really is. They just don't. And they continue to grossly underestimate the Russian government, its leadership, and the Russian people. You can't do that. And in the meantime, they are on the bridge of the financial economic version of the Titanic. And their view is the iceberg that we hit back there a few kilometers ago, minor consideration. Don't worry about it. And I don't think that they're going to wise up until the waves lap over the decks and reach the bridge.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I appreciate all the insight that you bring to these stories, the news, all of your decades of experience. Thank you so much again for coming on today's show.
Sure. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you for sticking with us all the way to the end. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Make sure the notification bell is turned on so you don't miss any important news. Thank you for sticking with us all the way to the end. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Make sure the notification bell is turned on so you don't miss any important news.